The transmission from the galactic core didn't ask for help. It wept. A chorus of 70 alien species watching their civilizations burn to ash. When our warp signature finally registered on the Coalition's long-range sensors, they expected the cavalry, an armada of shining dreadnoughts to push back the dark. Instead, space tore open like a cheap zipper, and out drifted the Shiloh. One ship. It was asymmetrical, deeply scarred, and vented exhaust that smelled intensely of rotten eggs and iron. The galaxy had begged for an army. Humanity sent a sledgehammer. The transition out of faster-than-light travel didn't feel like gliding onto a glass lake. It felt like a car crash. Caleb Ford slammed his eyes shut as the Shiloh violently decelerated, his teeth clacking together hard enough to chip a molar. The inertial dampeners groaned a deep metallic shrieking that vibrated through the soles of his boots and settled in his lower back. His stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. The bridge smelled like it always did, after a jump-burnt ozone, stale, recycled air, and the sour tang of nervous sweat. Real space. Wyatt grunted from the helm. The pilot didn't look back. His knuckles were white on the manual override sticks. Engines reading nominal. Coolant pressure dropping, but it's holding in the green. "Show me the neighborhood," Caleb said. He rubbed his jaw. His beard was 2 days overgrown, rough and itchy against his palm. He needed a shower. He needed a cigarette. He settled for biting the inside of his cheek until he tasted copper. The main view screen flickered static, washing over the tempered glass before the optical sensors resolved the image. Nobody spoke. It was a graveyard. The Coalition fleet, or what was left of it, hung in the dead vacuum of Sector 4. Caleb had read the briefing files. He knew the alien ships were supposed to be beautiful, elegant, sweeping arcs of spun, crystalline alloy and bioluminescent sails that rode solar winds. Now they were just debris. Jagged shards of glass and twisted silver drifted against the black backdrop. Clouds of frozen atmosphere sparkled like cruel glitter in the void. A few of the larger dreadnoughts were still intact, huddled together in a defensive sphere, their pale blue energy shields flickering like dying fluorescent bulbs. "God Almighty," Sullivan whispered from the comms station. She swallowed hard, the sound loud in the quiet bridge. "Reading thermal blooms, a lot of them, mostly cooling. We missed the main event." "We didn't miss it," Caleb said, his voice flat. He leaned forward, bracing his forearms on the command console. The metal was cold. "They're just taking a breather." Sullivan hailed the flagship. "Let them know the United Nations system sent their regards." Sullivan's fingers danced over the heavy mechanical switches of her board. Humanity hadn't adopted the holographic, touch-sensitive interfaces the rest of the galaxy used. Touch screens shattered when the bulkheads buckled. Physical switches stayed where you put them. "Channel open, Captain." The main screen split. On the right, the wreckage. On the left, the bridge of the Coalition flagship. The alien commander standing there was a tall, impossibly slender biped. Its skin was the color of bruised plums, covered in a fine, iridescent sheen. It wore a uniform of seamless white fabric that looked utterly pristine, which only made the panic in its large, multifaceted black eyes more jarring. The translator software kicked in a second, late rendering the alien's frantic clicking into a flat, synthesized baritone. "Identify. You are flying a primitive ballistic signature. Are you a scavenger vessel? Flee this sector. The swarm is returning." Caleb pressed the comms pedal by his foot. "This is Captain Caleb Ford of the UNS Shiloh. We received the distress beacon. We're your reinforcement." The alien commander stared. The multifaceted eyes seemed to dilate, processing the heavy steel plating, the exposed piping, and the grime-smeared walls of the Shiloh's bridge. It processed Caleb's stained fatigue jacket and Wyatt's heavily tattooed neck. "You are one ship," the alien said. The synthesized voice couldn't hide the total crushing despair. "We lost 400 dreadnoughts in the last cycle. Your species, you sent one primitive kinetic vessel." Caleb felt a flare of irritation, but it was quickly smothered by a cold, heavy exhaustion. He didn't feel like a savior. He felt like a 50-year-old man with bad knees and a mild ulcer who had been awake for 30 hours. "Yeah," Caleb said softly. "Just us. Send over your tactical data. We need to see what we're working with." "You are going to die here, Captain Ford," the alien said. The transmission cut out. Caleb stared at the blank screen for a long moment. He reached into his breast pocket, felt the crumpled pack of nicotine gum, and pulled a piece out. He chewed it aggressively, the sharp peppermint burning his throat. "Miller," Caleb called out without turning around. "Sir," the tactical officer responded. "Spin up the railguns. Open the silo doors on tubes 1 through 4. Let's make sure the powder is dry." "Aye, Captain. Spinning up." A low, guttural vibration began deep within the bowels of the Shiloh. It wasn't the hum of an energy weapon. It was the physical, terrifying friction of massive magnetic coils charging up to hurl solid slugs of depleted uranium at a fraction of the speed of light. The deck plates rattled. A loose wrench somewhere in the maintenance crawl space clattered against a pipe. Caleb looked back at the view screen. The swarm. They had eaten half the galaxy. The Coalition's energy weapons just splashed against their organic hulls. Their shields absorbed plasma and dispersed lasers. "Let's see how they handle math and gravity," Caleb thought. His stomach clenched again, sending a sharp spike of pain up his esophagus. He wasn't entirely sure this would work, but it was too late to go home. Docking with the Coalition flagship, the Radiant Dawn, was a logistical nightmare. The alien docking collar was designed for magnetic lock smooth seals. The Shiloh had a universal docking tube that essentially clamped on like a rusty pair of vice grips and blew expanding foam into the gaps to hold the atmosphere. Caleb stepped through the airlock, followed by Miller and 2 heavily armored Marines. The transition between the ships was physically jarring. On the Shiloh, the gravity was set to a punishing 1.2 Gs. The air smelled like machine oil, and the lighting was a harsh industrial yellow. Stepping onto the Radiant Dawn was like stepping into a high-end spa. The gravity dropped to a floaty 0.8 Gs. The air was cool, smelling faintly of something floral like lavender and ozone. The corridors were vast, curving, and lit by a soft, ambient glow that seemed to come from the walls themselves. But beneath the pristine aesthetic, the reality of war was bleeding through. Alien crew members, some plum-skinned like the commander, others insectoid or covered in pale fur, hurried past. Many were wounded. Caleb saw a furred alien missing an arm, the stump cauterized by a neat, glowing bandage. The air of panic was thick enough to choke on. No one looked at the humans. They were busy preparing to die. The Coalition commander, who introduced himself simply as Fleet Master, Valen, the translator's best approximation of his rank, met them outside the tactical center. Up close, Valen looked even more fragile. He was a full head taller than Caleb, but his limbs were painfully thin. "Captain Ford," Valen said, his black eyes twitching. "I apologize for my earlier brevity. We are evacuating the non-essential crew to the escape pods. Not that it will matter once the swarm jumps back into the system." "Appreciate the warm welcome," Caleb muttered. He didn't offer his hand. He knew from the briefings that physical contact was considered aggressive in their culture. Let's look at the map. The tactical center was a vast, dome-shaped room. In the center, a 3-dimensional holographic projection of the local system floated in mid-air. It was beautiful. Swirling blues and golds represented gravity wells and asteroid belts. Valen waved a long, multi-jointed finger. A massive cloud of red dots appeared on the edge of the system. The swarm. Valen said, his voice flat. They are biological. Deep space predators. They do not communicate. They do not negotiate. They consume. Our plasma batteries only feed their thermal receptors. Our lasers are refracted by their carapace. We cannot hurt them, Captain. Caleb stepped closer to the hologram. He squinted. The red dots weren't just ships. They were massive, writhing things. Space whales made of chitin and hate. What's their armor composition? Miller asked. He pulled out a battered, grease-stained datapad, completely ignoring the elegant floating interfaces around him. A biological lattice, Valen said, visibly confused by Miller's primitive device. It absorbs and dissipates thermal and directed energy impacts. Right, Miller said, chewing on his lower lip. But how does it handle kinetic trauma, blunt force? Valen tilted his head. Kinetic? You mean throwing rocks? Spicy rocks, Miller corrected, tapping his datapad. Dense ones, moving very fast. Valen looked at Caleb, horror dawning in his eyes. You use ballistic weaponry that was outlawed by the Concord 10,000 cycles ago. It is barbaric. It creates debris fields. It is imprecise. Caleb felt the exhaustion weighing on his shoulders. He felt an intense, irrational urge to sit down right there on the pristine, glowing floor and go to sleep. Instead, he forced out a dry, rattling cough. Fleet Master. Caleb said, his voice grating and quiet. With all due respect, your civilized weapons are getting your people slaughtered. The Shiloh is a siege breaker. We don't do elegant. We do blunt force trauma. Caleb looked at the red dots. Thousands of them. He felt a cold sweat prickle at his hairline. The bravado he projected was a thin veneer over a deep, churning well of terror. He wasn't a hero. He remembered his ex-wife's face when he signed up for this tour. She had called him a fool chasing a death wish. Maybe she was right. He looked at his hands. They were trembling slightly. He clenched them into fists and shoved them deep into his jacket pockets. They will be in firing range in 20 of your minutes, Valen said, turning away. Do what you must, Captain. But you are spitting into a hurricane. Miller, Caleb said, turning his back on the hologram. Get back to the ship. Tell Wyatt to bring us about. Dead center of the coalition formation. They're going to use us as a shield, Miller noted quietly. Let them, Caleb replied. He looked down at the slick, glowing floor, watching his own reflection in the alien architecture. We're the only shield that's going to hold. By the time Caleb got back to the bridge of the Shiloh, the atmosphere was so tense it felt like breathing underwater. The smell of fear was entirely human now, a sharp, acrid scent that overpowered the air scrubbers. Tactical feed is live, Sullivan said, her voice tight. They're entering the sector, visual sensors picking them up. Put it on the glass, Caleb ordered, strapping himself into the heavy command chair. The harness clicked into place over his chest. It was a purely mechanical restraint, designed to keep him from breaking his neck if the gravity failed. The view screen shifted. The blackness of space seemed to boil. The swarm wasn't a fleet of ships. It was a migration. Massive, jagged leviathans propelled themselves through the vacuum, venting thick clouds of glowing green biological exhaust. They looked like deep-sea crustaceans, scaled up to the size of skyscrapers, covered in thick, layered plating that absorbed the starlight. Around the leviathans swarmed thousands of smaller, darting organisms, twitching with nervous, predatory energy. Range, Caleb asked. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He hated this part, the waiting, the absolute certainty that people were about to die. 400,000 kilometers. Miller read off his screen. Closing fast. Coalition ships are powering up their shields. They're falling back. Cowards, Wyatt muttered from the helm. They're surviving, Wyatt, Caleb snapped. Focus on your job. Bring the bow up 5 degrees. I want a clear firing solution on the lead Leviathan. The Shiloh groaned as the massive thrusters fired, reorienting the heavy cruiser. Through the view screen, the alien coalition ships looked like fragile, glowing ornaments retreating behind the ugly grey slab of the human dreadnought. Target locked, Miller said. Silo doors are open. Main battery is hot. Range 300,000. They're charging, Sullivan yelled. Biological energy spikes detected in the lead elements. They're getting ready to spit. Brace for impact, Caleb shouted. There was no sound in space, but the Shiloh had localized acoustic sensors that translated hull impacts into audio to aid situational awareness. The bridge filled with a terrifying wet hiss as the swarm opened fire. Torrents of caustic, glowing green plasma washed over the Shiloh. The human ship didn't have energy shields. Energy shields could be overwhelmed, popped like soap bubbles. The Shiloh had 4 meters of high-density, ablative ceramic titanium armor. The ship shuddered violently. The lights flickered, dimmed, and then snapped back to emergency red. The temperature on the bridge spiked instantly. Caleb tasted sweat on his upper lip. The deck plating vibrated so hard his teeth ached. "Damage report!" Caleb yelled over the blaring klaxons. "Armor holding." Miller barked back, coughing, as a wisp of smoke drifted from his console. "Outer layer is burning off, but the hull is intact. Heat sinks are at 40% capacity." On the alien frequency, Caleb could hear the panicked transmissions of the Coalition. They were watching the human ship just sit there and take a barrage that would have melted their elegant dreadnoughts into slag. "Range," Caleb demanded, his knuckles white on the armrests. 200,000. Point blank for the main gun, sir. Caleb took a deep, shaky breath. The air smelled of burning insulation and hot metal. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling the immense, crushing weight of the moment. Then he opened them. Miller. Fire 1. Firing 1. The Shiloh physically bucked backward. The sound of the main railgun firing wasn't a laser's hum or a plasma weapon's crackle. It was the deafening, bone-shattering thoom of a magnetic launch sequence ripping a 6-ton slug of tungsten out of the barrel at 0.3 yaour. The recoil dampeners screamed. Dust fell from the ceiling grates. Caleb was thrown against his harness, the straps biting painfully into his collarbones. On the view screen there was no glowing beam of light. There was simply nothing. The projectile moved too fast for the naked eye. A split second later, the lead Leviathan, a beast the size of a small moon, shuddered. Its biological lattice armor designed to diffuse the heat of a star was entirely useless against sheer, brutal kinetic energy. The tungsten slug struck the center of mass. It didn't burn. It didn't melt. It simply transferred a godlike amount of kinetic force in a microsecond. The Leviathan didn't explode. It shattered. The impact cracked the massive creature down the middle. Black, freezing ichor erupted into the vacuum of space. Massive chunks of biological armor, thousands of tons each, spun wildly out of control, smashing into the smaller swarm creatures around it, turning the formation into a chaotic meat grinder of its own making. Silence fell over the bridge of the Shiloh, save for the heavy panting of the crew and the hum of the cooling systems. On the comms, the alien coalition channels had gone completely, utterly dead. "Target destroyed," Miller said, his voice trembling slightly. He looked up from his screen, staring at the carnage on the glass. "Sir, it broke." Caleb let out a long, slow exhale. His hands were still shaking, but a grim, hard knot formed in his stomach. The fear receded, replaced by the cold, mechanical necessity of survival. "Load tube 2, Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Wyatt, push us forward. Give me a firing solution on the next big bastard in the line." "Sir," Wyatt replied, his hands flying across the helm controls. The Shiloh battered, scorching and trailing smoke, ignited its main thrusters, and charged directly into the heart of the swarm. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't pretty. It was just a bar fight in the dark, and humanity had brought a broken bottle. The silence from the coalition fleet didn't last. It was broken by a frantic, overlapping chorus of synthesized alien clicks and whistles, bleeding through Sullivan's comms board like a nest of disturbed insects. They had just watched a god bleed. To them, the swarm was an unstoppable force of nature, a cosmic eraser. To the Shiloh, it was just a target with a massive heat signature. But the swarm was not a machine. It didn't experience system failures or rout when its command structure fell. It was an apex predator, and the Shiloh had just punched it in the nose. The writhing mass of biological ships paused. It was a momentary hesitation, a collective ripple through the dark, as if the hive mind was suddenly painfully aware of the ugly grey metal box floating in their path. Then the swarm shifted. They stopped ignoring the Shiloh to chase the retreating alien dreadnoughts. Thousands of red dots on Miller's tactical screen suddenly changed trajectory, converging on the center. "They're angry," Miller said. His voice was too high, stretched thin by adrenaline. He kept swallowing his Adam's apple, bobbing rapidly above the collar of his uniform. "Targeting locks. I have too many. They're all coming." "Let them come," Caleb rasped. His throat felt like sandpaper. He reached for his water pouch, strapped to the side of his chair, but his hand was trembling too badly to unclip it. He abandoned the effort, wiping a sheen of cold sweat from his forehead with the back of a grime-stained sleeve. "Wyatt, keep the bow facing the densest cluster. Present the heaviest armor. Do not let them get under us." "Aye, Captain," Wyatt grunted. The pilot was entirely hunched over his yoke neck muscles, corded and tight. The tattoos on his skin seemed to stretch as he fought the manual thruster controls. "Inertial dampeners are whining. They don't like these short burns." "Tell maintenance to ignore the dampeners," Caleb said. "Let them blow if they have to. We need the agility." The view screen filled with green. It wasn't a coordinated barrage. It was a deluge. Hundreds of the smaller swarm creatures, ships the size of frigates, darted into range and began violently expelling the caustic glowing plasma from their bio-sacs. It slapped against the Shiloh's forward armor like waves hitting a breakwater. The acoustic sensors translated the impacts into a deafening continuous roar. The deck bucked wildly. Caleb was thrown against his restraints again, the nylon straps biting hard enough to leave bruises. The bridge lights didn't just flicker this time. They died completely. For 3 agonizing seconds, the only light on the bridge came from the glow of the tactical screens and the terrifying neon green wash of the plasma, melting the outer hull, visible through the reinforced glass. Then the emergency reserves kicked in, bathing the bridge in a bloody crimson glare. "Armor degradation at 20% on the forward bow," Miller shouted over the din. "It's eating through the ablative layers, hull temperature rising, so the heat sinks are struggling. Vent the primary coolant lines into the forward baffles," Caleb ordered. He didn't yell. Yelling wasted oxygen and fed panic. He kept his voice deliberately low, a gravelly anchor in the chaos. Inside his stomach was twisting itself into knots. He could smell it now, the distinct, nauseating odor of burning paint and melting synthetic rubber filtering through the air scrubbers. It smelled like the end of the world. Miller autoloaders on tubes 2 and 3. Stagger the fire. I want a steady rhythm. Tubes loaded. Firing solution locked on secondary Leviathans. Fire! The dual thoom-thoom of the railguns shook the ship so violently that a secondary display panel above Sullivan's console tore loose from its mountings, sparking wildly as it crashed to the deck. On the screen, 2 more of the massive biological capital ships ruptured. The kinetic transfer turned their own massive internal pressures against them. They burst like overripe fruit, their thick carapaces fragmenting outward, into the swarm tearing through the smaller vessels escorting them. It was a massacre, but it was a massacre of attrition. "Wyatt Rolus 20 degrees port," Caleb said, watching the tactical map. "Spread the heat distribution across the hull." "Rolling." The artificial gravity groaned, struggling to compensate for the sudden violent rotation. Caleb felt his stomach heave. The mild ulcer he'd been nursing for 3 years flared into a sharp, agonizing spike of pain just below his ribs. He gritted his teeth, tasting blood where he'd bitten his cheek. "Captain," Sullivan called out. She was pale, her hands hovering over her earpiece. "I'm getting a hail. It's the Coalition flagship." "Put him on." Fleetmaster Valen's image snapped onto the secondary screen. The alien commander was no longer standing on a pristine bridge. The soft ambient light of his command center was strobing rapidly. Smoke, thin and purple, drifted behind him. "Captain Ford." Valen's synthesized voice translated, stripping away the alien's native inflections, but leaving the frantic cadence. "We are observing your engagements. It is horrific. But your kinetic weapons, they are cracking the carapaces." "That's the point, Valen," Caleb said, rubbing his chest. "We break the shell. Our sensors indicate that the internal biological structures of the Leviathans are entirely vulnerable once the kinetic lattice is fractured." Valen continued, realization dawning in his multifaceted eyes. "They are soft inside." "Most things are," Caleb muttered. "If you can fracture the vanguard," Valen said, "we can move the Radiant Dawn and our remaining dreadnoughts into a flanking position. Our thermal weapons can ignite the exposed viscera. We can burn them from the inside out." Caleb stared at the alien. For the first time since the Shiloh had dropped out of warp, he felt a tiny, fragile sliver of hope. It wasn't a guarantee of survival. But it was a tactic. It was a plan. "Do it," Caleb said. "But you better move fast, Fleetmaster. We're an ugly ship, but we can't take this pounding forever. Our armor is melting." "We are moving," Valen said. The transmission cut. Caleb looked back at the main screen. The swarm was closing the distance. They were no longer just firing plasma. The smaller, faster organisms were attempting to latch onto the Shiloh itself. "Miller," Caleb said, his voice hard, "switch to flak on the point defense cannons. Shred anything that gets within a kilometer of our paint." "Flak armed," Miller replied. "Sir, they're not just spitting plasma anymore. I'm reading concentrated acid signatures. They're trying to dissolve the airlocks." Caleb felt a cold chill run down his spine, completely independent of the rising heat on the bridge. "Seal all external bulkheads. Double the localized magnetic fields on the outer doors." He leaned back in his chair, the heavy metal cold against his sweaty fatigues. The real fight was just starting. There is a distinct, unforgettable sound when the vacuum of space finally wins. It isn't a dramatic explosion. It's a terrifying, high-pitched whistle, followed by the deep, structural groan of metal, screaming as pressure differentials tear it apart. It happened 40 minutes into the engagement. The Shiloh had cracked 6 more Leviathans, paving a road of shattered chitin and freezing black blood through the void. The Coalition dreadnoughts, moving with a desperate, terrified grace, had swept in, behind the kinetic strikes, pouring concentrated beams of coherent light and superheated plasma into the gaping wounds of the swarm ships. The synergy was devastating. The human sledgehammer broke the door. The alien flamethrowers cleared the room. But the swarm adapted. They stopped trying to outgun the Shiloh. They swarmed it. Thousands of the smaller frigate-sized beasts ignored the flak cannons, sacrificing themselves by the dozens to close the distance. They slammed their biological bodies directly into the hull of the dreadnought, dying on impact, but leaving behind massive caustic pustules of concentrated hypercorrosive enzyme. Hull integrity critical in Sector 7. Miller yelled, his voice cracking. He slammed his fist onto his console. The armor is gone. The acid is eating through the secondary titanium plating. It's moving too fast. Sector 7. The starboard gunnery decks. Caleb's heart dropped. The bridge was deafening, a cacophony of blaring alarms and the continuous bone-shaking rumble of the railguns. But all Caleb could hear was the sudden rush of blood in his own ears. He knew who was in Sector 7. Damage control, Caleb barked into his comms. Get repair crews to Deck 4 starboard side. Foam sprayers, anything you have. Stop that burn. Sir. A voice crackled back over the internal net. It was Lieutenant Russo, the starboard gunnery officer. His voice was remarkably calm, but there was a tight, strained edge to it. The acid is through the sealing plates. It's dripping onto the autoloaders. The foam isn't neutralizing it. It's just feeding the reaction. Caleb pulled up the internal feed on his secondary monitor. The camera angle was distorted by thick, yellowish smoke, but he could see the gunnery deck. It was a nightmare. The thick metal ceiling was sagging, glowing a sickening bright orange. Globs of green gelatinous acid were raining down on the massive hydraulic machinery of the railgun. Crew members in heavy environmental suits were scrambling, firing chemical retardant, but the acid was eating through the foam, the deck plates, and the machinery with terrifying speed. One of the globs hit a crewman's shoulder. The man didn't scream. The vacuum of his suit prevented it, but Caleb watched him thrash wildly as the acid ate through the heavy Kevlar weave fabric, in seconds melting into the flesh beneath. Two others tried to drag him away, slipping on the slick, melting deck. Russo, Caleb said, his chest tight. Evacuate the compartment. Pull your people back behind bulkhead 7 Alpha. If we abandon the deck, we lose the starboard battery, Captain, Russo replied. The camera feed showed Russo standing near the primary loading crane, manually cranking a jammed hydraulic line, while acid hissed inches from his boots. And the acid is spreading toward the primary ammunition magazines. If it hits the tungsten reserves, I know, Caleb cut him off. Tungsten wouldn't explode, but the magnetic charge caps on the slugs would. It would blow the entire starboard side of the ship into orbit. I said evacuate, Lieutenant. We need 3 minutes to manually lock the blast doors over the magazine, Russo said. The automatic servos are melted. We have to crank it. You don't have 3 minutes, Miller shouted from his station, looking at the structural readout. Captain, the outer hull is gone. The pressure differential is going to blow the compartment in less than 60 seconds. Caleb froze. The air on the bridge suddenly felt freezing cold. He looked at the main view screen. The swarm was pressing in. The Shiloh was bleeding. He looked at the internal monitor. Russo and 4 other men were throwing their entire body weight against the massive manual hand cranks of the magazine blast doors. He had to make the call. The cold, ugly arithmetic of command. 5 men against a crew of 400. 1 compartment against the ship. It was the easiest decision in the world, and it was the one that was going to damn his soul. Russo, Caleb said softly. Almost got it. Captain. Russo grunted, his face, visibly red and slick with sweat inside his helmet visor. Just 20 more seconds. Caleb closed his eyes. He couldn't watch. Sullivan, Caleb whispered. Seal bulkhead 7 Alpha. Emergency override. Drop the heavy doors. Sullivan looked up, her eyes wide. Sir, they're still inside. Do it, Sullivan. Now. Sullivan choked back a sob and slammed her hand onto the manual lockdown switch. On the internal monitor, the massive 3-foot-thick steel blast doors of Bulkhead 7 Alpha slammed down with terrifying finality, sealing off the gunnery deck from the rest of the ship. "Captain!" Russo's voice crackled over the comms, confused. "Bulkhead just dropped. We're locked in." "I'm sorry, Lieutenant," Caleb said. His voice was entirely hollow. He felt detached from his own body, a ghost haunting his own command chair. "I can't risk the ship." There was a pause, a long, agonizing 2 seconds of static. "Understood," Russo said quietly. There was no anger, just a profound, heavy acceptance. "Magazine is locked. Tell my—" The high-pitched whistle tore through the comms line, followed instantly by the deafening crack of the outer hull, giving way completely. The camera feed went instantly to static. The Shiloh violently listed to starboard as the explosive decompression vented atmosphere equipment and 5 human beings into the unforgiving void. Caleb sat perfectly still. The deck vibrated under his boots. He could smell copper. It wasn't the smell of the ship. It was the smell of blood. He had bitten completely through the inside of his cheek. He tasted the iron warm and sharp on his tongue. "Atmosphere contained." Miller reported, his voice entirely monotone. He wasn't looking at Caleb. No one was. "Bulkhead 7 Alpha is holding. We lost the starboard battery. Redirect power to the port and forward guns," Caleb said. His voice didn't shake. He didn't allow it to. He buried the sick, heavy guilt deep down in the dark, cramped box in his mind where he kept the faces of everyone he'd lost. He would open it later, if he lived. "Wyatt, compensate for the mass loss on the starboard side. Keep our nose pointed at the biggest heat signature you can find." "Compensating," Wyatt whispered. The Shiloh surged forward again, limping, bleeding atmosphere from a dozen minor microfractures, but it didn't stop. It couldn't. The battle degenerated from a tactical engagement into a brutal, claustrophobic melee. Space combat, as depicted in the Coalition's elegant holovids, was a matter of long-range sensor locks and graceful evasive maneuvers. This was a knife fight in a phone booth. The Shiloh was the anvil. Caleb sat in the command chair, his uniform soaked in sweat, his breathing shallow and rapid. The bridge was a disaster zone. Smoke hung thick in the air, catching the red emergency lights and turning the room into a glowing, hellish cavern. Sullivan was bleeding from a cut above her eyebrow, the blood drying in a jagged line down her cheek, but her hands never stopped moving across the comms board. Wyatt was fighting the helm like a man wrestling a bear, veins bulging in his neck. "Range to the swarm core?" Caleb asked. 80,000 kilometers, Miller replied. He was coughing heavily, the acrid smoke irritating his lungs. "They're condensing. They realize we're cracking their big hitters. They're forming a biological wall to protect the hive ship." Caleb leaned forward, peering through the smoke at the main screen. In the center of the swarm, protected by layers of massive armored leviathans, was a monstrosity. It was larger than any station Caleb had ever seen. It didn't look like a ship. It looked like a floating tumor pulsing with sick bioluminescent green veins. "That's the brain," Caleb murmured. "If we kill that, the rest of them scatter. So we have 2 operational railguns left," Miller said, wiping soot from his screen. "Tubes 1 and 4. 2 and 3 overheated, the magnetic coils fused. We have exactly 12 tungsten slugs left. 12 shots." "Valen," Caleb barked into the open comms channel. The alien fleet master appeared on screen. His pristine white uniform was scorched, and his command center looked as battered as the Shiloh's. The Coalition had taken heavy losses, moving into the close-range flanking positions, but they hadn't broken. The sheer ugly stubbornness of the human dreadnought seemed to have infected them. "Captain Ford, we are holding the perimeter, but they are pressing us hard. Our thermal reserves are draining." "I see the hive ship," Caleb said, "but there's a wall of armor between us and it. I have enough kinetic rounds left to punch a hole through that wall, but not enough to kill the brain." Valen's eyes dilated. "You want us to thread the needle?" "I'm going to create a tunnel, Valen. A straight kinetic corridor right through their vanguard. When I do, I need you and every dreadnought you have left to pour everything you've got down that pipe. I want a continuous beam of plasma and laser fire concentrated on the hive ship. Can you coordinate that?" Valen didn't hesitate. The elegant, civilized alien who had balked at the idea of throwing rocks was gone. In his place was a survivor. "We will be ready, Captain. On your mark." "Miller," Caleb said, dropping the channel. "Load tubes 1 and 4. Override the safety limiters on the magnetic coils." Miller looked up, horrified. "Sir, if we override the limiters, the feedback will cook the internal wiring. The guns will fire, but they'll tear themselves apart. We'll be completely defenseless." "We're already defenseless, Miller," Caleb said, his voice flat and tired. "We're a flying brick. Load the guns." "Aye, Captain. Overriding safeties. Tubes 1 and 4 hot." Caleb watched the screen. The swarm wall was a writhing mass of interlocking armor plates. It was impregnable to energy weapons, but it was just meat and shell. "Why at full burn? Ramming speed. I want us so close we can smell them." Wyatt let out a feral, breathless laugh. "You got it, boss. Full burn." The Shiloh's engines screamed. The massive dreadnought lurched forward, accelerating with terrifying speed directly toward the biological wall. The G-force slammed Caleb back into his seat. His vision tunneled the edges, turning grey, as blood rushed from his head. The groaning of the hull sounded like tearing paper. 50,000 kilometers, Miller called out, his voice straining against the G's. 40, 30. The swarm realized what the humans were doing. The wall of leviathans began to shift, bracing for impact, glowing fiercely as they prepared to unleash a point-blank volley of acid and plasma. "Now, Miller, fire!" The Shiloh fired. Without the safety limiters, the railguns didn't just fire, they detonated. The magnetic coils surged with so much power that the electrical feedback blew out every fuse on the forward decks. Sparks rained down on the bridge like a fireworks display. The noise was absolute, a physical blow that shattered the remaining glass on the secondary consoles. 2 massive tungsten slugs, moving faster than anything the Shiloh had ever fired, tore through the void. They hit the swarm wall simultaneously. The kinetic transfer was apocalyptic. The front layer of leviathans didn't just shatter, they vaporized into a fine mist of frozen gore and pulverized chitin. The sheer force of the impact carried the shrapnel forward like a colossal shotgun blast, tearing through the second and third layers of the biological wall. For a brief, agonizing second, there was a hole. A perfect, clean tunnel carved through the absolute center of the swarm, leading directly to the pulsing, vulnerable flesh of the hive ship. The Shiloh, its forward momentum unchecked. Its guns destroyed its armor, melting drifted helplessly toward the gap it had just created. "Valen!" Caleb roared into the comms, his voice cracking. "Light them up!" From behind the battered, smoking bulk of the human, Dreadnought the Galaxy responded. The Radiant Dawn and 40 remaining coalition ships moved in perfect unison. They didn't fire individual blasts. They linked their targeting arrays and poured every ounce of thermal energy they had left into a single combined beam of blinding, searing white light. The beam shot past the Shiloh so close that the proximity alarms on the human ship screamed in protest. The sheer heat of the energy weapon scorched the remaining paint off the Shiloh's hull. The beam entered the kinetic tunnel. It struck the hive ship dead center. The biological armor of the hive ship was designed to absorb heat, but it was designed to absorb the heat of a star over a surface area of kilometers. It was not designed to take the combined thermal output of 40 dreadnoughts, concentrated onto a single point. The hive ship didn't explode. It shrieked. It was a psychic scream that echoed through the comms channels, a terrifying, inhuman wail of agony that made Sullivan tear off her headset and clamp her hands over her ears. The tumorous mass boiled. The green bioluminescence turned a violent, blinding white. And then the massive organism simply collapsed in on itself, burning from the inside out, until nothing was left but a cloud of glowing, irradiated ash. On the bridge of the Shiloh, Caleb slumped in his chair. The emergency lights flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness, save for the pale, ghostly light of the burning swarm drifting through the shattered view screen. The sledgehammer had broken, but the anvil held. The absolute silence that follows an explosion is a lie. It is never truly silent. It is a dense, physical pressure in the ears, a high-pitched, relentless whine that burrows deep into the skull and refuses to leave. Caleb Ford sat in the pitch black of the bridge, suspended only by the biting nylon straps of his harness. The artificial gravity had failed the moment the main power grid blew, leaving the crew weightless in the dark. Beside the ringing in his ears, there was only the sound of his own breathing, ragged wet and echoing inside his own chest. Slowly, other sounds began to bleed through the ringing. The terrifying metallic groans of the Shiloh settling, thousands of tons of ablative armor and internal superstructure cooling rapidly in the vacuum, the thermal contraction sounding like muffled gunshots echoing down the corridors. "Sound off," Caleb croaked. His throat felt like it was coated in ground glass. The air was already growing thin, the scrubbers dead, leaving behind a thick, choking atmosphere of burnt synthetic rubber ozone and the distinct coppery tang of fresh blood. A cough in the dark, then the sharp, artificial snap of a chemical glow stick breaking. A sickly, pale green light flooded the immediate area around the tactical console. Miller was floating inches above his chair, one hand gripping the edge of the console to anchor himself, the other holding the plastic tube. Blood was weeping freely from his nose, floating in tiny, perfect crimson spheres through the zero-gravity air. "Miller alive," the tactical officer gasped. He sounded incredibly young, just a terrified kid in a dark room. Wyatt came a grunt from the front. The pilot had unbuckled and was bracing himself against the shattered remains of the helm. "Alive. Left arm feels dislocated. I can't feel my fingers." Caleb turned his head. The movement sent a blinding spike of pain down his neck. "Sullivan!" There was no answer. "Sullivan!" Caleb barked the command instinct, fighting through the crushing exhaustion. He unclipped his harness. The sudden release of tension sent him drifting upward. He grabbed the armrest, pulling his heavy frame down hand over hand, navigating the floating debris. A shattered datapad, a loose bolt, a single soot-stained work glove. He reached the comm station. Sullivan was still strapped in. Her eyes were wide, staring blankly at the dead screens. She was hyperventilating shallow, rapid gasps that weren't pulling in enough oxygen. "Breathe, Sully," Caleb said. His voice dropped the harsh command edge, becoming a low, steady anchor. He grabbed her shoulder. The fabric of her uniform was soaked in sweat. "Hey, look at me. We're stopped. The ride is over." She blinked, the trance breaking. A violent shiver racked her small frame. She looked at Caleb, her eyes welling with tears that didn't fall, merely pooled over her corneas in the microgravity. Did we get it? Caleb pushed himself off her console and drifted toward the forward blast shutters. The reinforced glass was spider-webbed with thousands of fractures, but it held. Beyond it, the void was illuminated by the ghostly fading fires of a dying armada. The swarm was broken. Without the hive ship broadcasting its constant suffocating will, the biological network had collapsed. The remaining leviathans were drifting aimlessly. Without the psychic tether to guide them, their primal instincts took over. Caleb watched as two of the massive frigate-sized beasts panicked and disoriented, turned on each other, tearing into thick chitin, with massive mandibles, spilling freezing ichor into the dark. Thousands of the smaller organisms were simply seizing, curling into tight, dead balls as their nervous systems overloaded and shut down. It was a graveyard, but this time it belonged to the enemy. "We got it," Caleb said quietly. He didn't feel victorious. He just felt incredibly deeply cold. A harsh mechanical clack echoed through the deck plating. The emergency gravity generators sputtered, whined, and violently kicked in at half capacity. Caleb dropped to the floor, landing hard on his bad knees. The pain was immediate and sharp, a familiar old enemy. Miller hit the deck with a yelp, and Wyatt let out a string of cursed oaths as his injured arm jarred against the bulkhead. The floating spheres of blood and debris rained down, splattering against the metal grates. A single red emergency strip light flickered to life above the primary access door, casting long, bloody shadows across the ruined bridge. The internal comms panel on the wall let out a burst of harsh static, followed by the heavily accented voice of Chief Engineer O'Malley. "Bridge, this is engineering. Do we have anyone breathing up there?" Caleb crawled over to the panel, hauling himself up by the metal railing. "Ford here. Status, Chief." "We're blind, deaf, and bleeding, Captain." O'Malley coughed. The sound of hissing steam and frantic hammering filled the background. "Main reactor scrammed to prevent a meltdown. We're on auxiliary batteries. Life support is pulling 10%. I can give you gravity and internal comms, but heat is a luxury we can't afford. Outer hull is compromised in 12 different sectors." "Can you patch the long-range arrays?" Caleb asked, rubbing his temple. "I need to know what the Coalition is doing. Give me 20 minutes to bypass the blown relays. Captain, I'm looking at the internal sensors." O'Malley's voice dropped, losing its usual gruff momentum. "Deck 4, starboard gunnery. I'm reading a hard vacuum." Caleb closed his eyes. The adrenaline that had kept him entirely focused was receding like a low tide, leaving the ugly, jagged rocks exposed. "I know, Chief," Caleb whispered. "Russo's team, gone." Silence hummed over the line, heavy and suffocating. "I'll get to work on those relays," Captain O'Malley finally said, his voice entirely hollow. The line clicked dead. Caleb leaned his forehead against the cold metal wall. He was a 50-year-old man who had spent his entire life learning how to keep ships flying and people breathing. Today, he had deliberately closed a door and let 5 of them suffocate, so the rest could live. The math was perfect. The reality was unbearable. He reached into his pocket for his nicotine gum. The pack was crushed. He pulled out a flattened, lint-covered square, unwrapped it with trembling, blood-stained fingers, and shoved it into his mouth. He chewed aggressively, waiting for the sharp bite of the peppermint to ground him. It tasted like ash. It took 45 minutes for the radiant dawn to drift close enough for visual contact. Through the cracked main view screen, the Coalition flagship looked like a wounded angel. Its elegant, sweeping, crystalline hull was heavily scorched, one of its bioluminescent sails torn completely away, leaving a jagged, sparking stump. But it still had power. Its soft blue shields flickered weakly, holding the vacuum at bay. The Shiloh looked like a piece of chewed scrap metal spat out by a garbage compactor. When O'Malley finally brute-forced the short-range comms, Valen's face appeared on Sullivan's miraculously surviving secondary monitor. The alien fleet master looked entirely drained. His white uniform was smeared with purple soot, and the iridescent sheen of his skin was dull and flat. "Captain Ford," Valen said. He paused, his large black eyes scanning the crimson-lit, smoke-filled background of the human bridge. "I am astonished to see you breathing. Takes a lot to kill a cockroach, Valen," Caleb replied. He was sitting in the command chair, not out of protocol, but because he wasn't entirely sure his legs would hold him up if he stood. "What's the tally?" "The swarm is broken." Valen reported a tremor in his synthesized voice. "Without the neural node, they are cannibalizing each other or starving. We are dispatching containment teams to incinerate the remains. The sector is secure. Your fleet, we lost another 40 vessels in the final push," Valen said softly, "but we survived. You provided the anvil, Captain. We merely struck the hammer." "You got that backward," Caleb muttered, rubbing his jaw. "But it doesn't matter. I need a medical team fleet master. My infirmary is overflowing. We have plasma burns, decompression trauma, and broken bones. We're out of painkillers and we're losing heat. We are extending a pressurized umbilical now," Valen said instantly. "We are sending our best trauma weavers. I am coming aboard myself. I must see this ship. I must understand how you survived." "You won't like what you see," Caleb warned. An hour later, Caleb was walking down the cramped, warped corridor of Deck 4. He had left the bridge to Wyatt, who was currently high on alien painkillers and sitting with a splintered arm. The gravity on Deck 4 was erratic, pulling slightly to the left, making Caleb stumble like a drunkard. The air was frigid, his breath pluming in white clouds in the dim emergency lighting. Behind him walked Valen. The towering alien had to duck beneath the sagging ceiling plates and exposed wiring. Valen was flanked by 2 alien medics, carrying sleek, floating medical cases. They looked around with sheer, unadulterated horror. They were used to pristine environments, sterile white light and soft curves. The Shiloh was a cathedral of brutalism, built entirely of sharp angles, heavy steel, and exposed, greasy machinery. The smell down here was atrocious. The air scrubbers hadn't cleared the lingering scent of the chemical retardant, melted titanium, and the subtle, horrific odor of cooked flesh from the plasma strikes. Valen kept a fine silken cloth pressed delicately against his olfactory slits. "Your vessel is primitive," Valen murmured, his synthesized voice echoing softly in the metal hallway. "It uses combustion. It relies on sheer density rather than energy deflection. By all our simulations, the swarm should have dissolved you in the first volley." "Simulations don't account for stubbornness," Caleb said, limping slightly. His left knee was swelling against the fabric of his trousers. "It is more than stubbornness, Captain," Valen said, stepping carefully over a twisted pile of melted grating. "It is a willingness to endure suffering that my people simply do not possess. When the swarm breached our hulls, our crews panicked. They accepted death. Your people, they fought the vacuum itself." Caleb stopped walking. They had reached the end of the corridor. The pathway was blocked by a massive 3-foot-thick wall of solid, unpainted steel. Bulkhead 7 Alpha. The metal around the frame was heavily warped, the paint blistered and peeled from the sheer heat of the acid that had tried to eat through it. But it had held. Caleb stared at the door. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the heavy manual locking mechanism. The thick wheel was still locked in the downward position, precisely where Sullivan had dropped it. "What is behind this door?" Valen asked gently, sensing the sudden shift in the human's demeanor. "Vacuum," Caleb said. His voice was entirely devoid of emotion. It was a flat, dead sound. "Ah," Valen said softly. "A breech compartment. We detected the explosive decompression from this sector during the battle." The alien stepped forward, reaching out a long, slender hand to touch the blistered metal. "Did the automated failsafes engage in time?" Caleb looked at Valen's hand. He felt a sudden violent urge to swat the alien away, to scream, to shatter the calm, civilized facade. Instead, he just shoved his hands deep into his pockets. "We don't have automated fail-safes," Caleb said. Valen froze. The alien slowly turned its large, multifaceted eyes to Caleb. The translator software took a second to process the cultural context. When it did, Valen's posture stiffened. You dropped this bulkhead manually?" Valen asked. "Yes. Were there crew inside?" "Lieutenant Russo," Caleb said, staring at the middle of the heavy steel door. "Petty Officer Chen, Specialists Davis, Aris, and Thorne, 5 men." Valen withdrew his hand from the door, as if the metal had suddenly become white hot. The alien medics behind him visibly recoiled, their soft clicks and whistles murmuring in distressed tones. "You sealed them in," Valen said, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "You knowingly trapped them in a breached compartment." "The acid was eating the autoloaders," Caleb said, repeating the cold, hard logic that he had used to justify it. "It was going to hit the magazine. If the magnetic caps detonated, it would have ripped the ship in half. They needed 3 minutes to manually crank the blast doors. They didn't have 3 minutes, but to order their deaths." Valen trailed off. In the coalition, a commander who lost a single life due to a direct order would be court-martialed, stripped of rank, and sent to a psychiatric facility. Their wars were fought with drones and energy fields. Flesh was considered too precious to sacrifice. "I didn't order their deaths." Caleb snapped his voice suddenly hard, echoing off the cramped walls. "The swarm killed them. I just made sure they were the only ones who died." He stepped up to the bulkhead. He placed his bare hand flat against the freezing, scarred steel. It was so cold, it burned his palm, but he didn't pull away. He needed to feel it. "You think we're heroes, Valen," Caleb said, quietly, his forehead resting against the heavy door. "You think we rode in on a white horse to save the galaxy. We didn't. We're just the people you call when the job is too ugly for a clean conscience." Valen stood in silence for a long time. The alien looked at the battered human captain, then back at the door. "I thought your species was barbaric because you throw kinetic metal," Valen finally said, his voice entirely devoid of judgment, replaced by a profound, somber understanding. "I was wrong. You are not barbaric. You are simply willing to bear the weight of survival. A weight that would crush us." Valen placed his hand back on the door, resting it gently beside Caleb's. It was a gesture of shared mourning, alien and human, touching the cold tomb of 5 men who bought a galaxy its tomorrow. "Come, Captain," Valen said softly. "Let us tend to the living." 3 days later, the sector was clear. The Shiloh was under tow. It had no main power, no functioning weapons, and half its internal atmosphere had to be constantly replenished by the heavy cruisers of the Coalition fleet that dragged it through the void. It looked less like a ship, and more like a massive rectangular asteroid of slagged metal and scorch marks. Caleb was sitting in the captain's quarters. The room was a mess. His bunk was bolted to the wall. His small desk was littered with hard copy casualty reports, and the single porthole was cracked, covered by a heavy titanium blast shutter. Doc Henderson, a balding man with permanent bags under his eyes, was wrapping Caleb's ribs tightly with a synthetic compression bandage. Too cracked, Henderson grunted, pulling the bandage taut. Caleb winced, a sharp hiss escaping his teeth. "You're lucky they didn't puncture a lung, Caleb. Between the G-forces of that final burn and whatever the hell you hit when the gravity failed, you look like a bruised plum." "Just tape it up, Doc," Caleb muttered, staring blankly at the metal wall. "I have a debriefing with the UN Admiralty at 0800. "The Admiralty can wait," Henderson said, tying off the bandage. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his blood-stained scrubs. He hadn't slept in 70 hours. None of the medical staff had. "You need sleep, real sleep, not that chemical garbage you've been taking to keep your eyes open." "Can't sleep," Caleb said honestly. He reached for his shirt, pulling it over his head. The fabric scraped against the bandages, but the pain was distant, muted. Whenever he closed his eyes, he didn't see the swarm dying. He didn't see the blinding light of the coalition fleet. He saw the red light of the bridge. He heard Rousseau's voice, calmly accepting his own execution. He felt the phantom vibration of the deck as the airlock blew. "Caleb," Henderson said, softly dropping the gruff doctor persona. "We lost 64 people, out of 400. It's a miracle it wasn't 399. You brought us through." "I brought a butcher's bill," Caleb replied, standing up. His knees popped audibly. He walked over to the desk and picked up a heavy dented metal thermos. He unscrewed the cap and took a sip of the lukewarm, bitter coffee inside. It tasted awful. It tasted perfect. A soft chime echoed from the door. "Enter," Caleb said. The heavy door slid open, whining in protest on warped tracks. Valen stepped in. The alien fleet master had shed his combat uniform, replacing it with flowing ceremonial robes of deep violet and silver. He carried a small ornate box made of spun crystal. "Captain Ford." Valen greeted, bowing his head deeply. It was a gesture of immense respect in his culture. Doc Henderson quietly packed his medical bag and slipped out of the room, leaving the two commanders alone. Fleet Master. Caleb nodded, leaning against his desk. "To what do I owe the pleasure we're a few days from the nearest UN staging ground? Figured you'd be busy coordinating the cleanup." Valen stepped fully into the room, looking around at the austere, bare metal walls. "I am. But I wanted to speak with you before our paths diverge. The Coalition Council has convened via tight beam. They have authorized me to present you with this." Valen extended his long arms, offering the crystal box. Caleb set his thermos down and opened the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was a heavy, perfectly spherical jewel that pulsed with a soft, inner golden light. "The Star of Antioch," Valen explained, his voice reverent. "It is the highest honor our coalition can bestow. It has only been awarded 3 times in 10,000 cycles. It is given to those who have saved a civilization." Caleb stared at the jewel. It was beautiful. It was flawless. It had absolutely no place on the Shiloh. He didn't pick it up. He closed the lid. "I appreciate the gesture, Valen," Caleb said quietly. "But you can take it back to your council." Valen looked confused, his multi-jointed fingers twitching. "Captain, is the honor insufficient, or have I offended your customs?" "It's not that," Caleb said, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked at the casualty report spread across his desk. 64 names. "It's just that medals are for people who won. We didn't win, Valen. We just survived. There's a difference." "You destroyed the swarm," Valen countered. "You broke the unbreakable. By sacrificing my own people," Caleb said sharply, his voice cracking for the first time. He leaned heavily against the desk, the exhaustion finally pulling him down. By turning this ship into a battering ram, we fought ugly, we fought dirty, we did things your people would be ashamed of. He looked up at the alien, his eyes red and shadowed. You don't pin a medal on a sledgehammer, Valen. You put it back in the shed until you need to break something else. Valen stood quietly, processing the deep, cynical well of human grief. The alien slowly reached out and placed the crystal box firmly on Caleb's desk, right on top of the casualty reports. Perhaps, Valen said softly, but the shed is a safer place today, because the sledgehammer did its job. Do not carry the weight of the galaxy alone, Captain Ford. You have earned your rest. Valen bowed again, deeper this time, and turned, walking out of the cabin, the heavy door sliding shut behind him. Caleb stood in the quiet room. He looked at the crystal box. Then he looked at the names on the paper beneath it. Russo, Chen, Davis, Aris, Thorne. He didn't touch the jewel. Instead, he reached out and traced his finger over the names. The paper was rough, standard-issue military stock. It felt real. The Shiloh groaned around him, a deep structural sigh as the tow cables pulled it through the dark. It was a broken, ugly ship filled with broken, tired people. They had brought primitive weapons to a god-tier war. They had bled, they had suffocated, and they had compromised their very souls to hold the line. But the line held. Caleb picked up his thermos, took another sip of the terrible coffee, and finally sat down in his chair. He closed his eyes. The red lights of the bridge faded. The phantom vibrations ceased. For the first time in 4 days, the captain of the UNS Shiloh allowed himself to sleep. The galaxy would spin on elegant and civilized and pristine, and humanity would remain in the dark, dirty and bruised, standing in the doorway, waiting for the next monsters to come knocking. If you felt the sheer weight of the Shiloh's desperate fight, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button to honor the crew of Sector 7 and share this video with fellow sci-fi fans who know that true grit beats pristine armor any day of the week. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another deep space HFY battle. Drop a comment below. Would you have made the same impossible call as Captain Ford? Let me know, and I'll see you in the next transmission. Keep holding the line.